Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Tech Takeaways. I'm your host, Jason Fitzgerald, and I'm joined as ever by my dynamic co-host, Paul Stringfellow.
Hello.
And Wayne Miller.
Hello.
And back by popular demand, John Hope from Sophos.
Hello.
Welcome back, John.
Thank you very much for having me back.
So this week's episode, we're going to be taking a look at and discussing generative AI. So what it is, kind of the challenges associated to it, really what people need to be aware of with it. So where do we want to start with this? Wayne,
I don't fully understand what it is, and maybe there's a lot of people who are, well, maybe there isn't. They're probably all technical people going, should we spend 5 minutes just for what is it? And, what are the pros and cons to it?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, for me, probably the most prevalent generative AI in use, your best friend, is the ChatGPT engine.
Okay. Now, if you'd have said ChatGPT, I'd have gone,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So generative AI, by definition, is an artificial intelligence that can generate new content based on content that it's learned from. So stuff that it's seen before. That's probably the correct definition of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think regular listeners to the show know that me and you have already talked about generative AI.
Of course, yeah.
And being as we were so amateurish in doing it, we thought we'd get an expert in to talk about generative AI. So John, is there anything else we should be thinking about in terms of, so ChatGPT is a great example, and I think it's the thing that has brought GenAI into kind of popular conversation, popular consciousness. But have you got a broader definition from a security professional point of view?
I think you've nailed it really on the definition side of things. What I would add is that there is a lot of skepticism around generative AI at the moment, and there are some quite significant security concerns and just concerns about how it will impact human life in general. But there's a lot of positives around AI. I mean, AI is not something maybe quite so new for me, because in the security industry, we've been using AI for a very long time. I mean, if you look at our labs and the research that we do, we see 650,000 new malware samples on a daily basis. And we could not find enough human beings to be able to dissect that, reverse engineer it, and create definitions so we can protect our customers using purely humans.
Signature-based.
Exactly, using signature-based systems just doesn't work anymore. Whereas AI is actually really good at being able to, in inverted commas, learn what it has seen before, how malware is normally structured, what it normally does, and then applying that to new samples that come in or new traffic that comes in. Because it can look at it and say, well, that looks very similar to the thing that the other day that caused a whole load of trouble to one particular organization. So it's likely to be malicious in nature. And that works really well in cybersecurity, because actually what you find is that cyber criminals, they're not typically massive innovators. Every new virus, every new attack is typically very similar and slightly different to the last version. So AI is super good at solving those challenges of being able to look at repetitive patterns.
And I think I actually think what AI is good at, and I'm sure people like me who are real pedants around stuff like this will be listening going, that's not really AI, but just bear with us. Let's just call it all AI for now. It's analytics at large scale, it's machine learning, there's deep language models, there's lots of versions of, but we'll just broadly call it AI for now. But I think you make a really good point about understanding what AI is good at, because I think while you're absolutely right in terms of ethical use of AI, and we were talking before we were recording actually about the kind of the actors' strike we're seeing at the moment, and some of the reasons behind that are the use of this kind of technology being used unethically to take work away from people who make a living acting. But in terms of the things you've just described, they're the things that AI are good at. It's good at looking at massive data sets and very quickly spotting trends, but it's not necessarily going to be really creative in doing that. It's just good at kind of crunching big amounts of data and coming up with something that looks intelligent. And I think that, I suppose what's important with that from my point of view is that when we all start talking about AI, is to not just sit there and relax and go, oh, there's some magic machine going to solve all of our problems. I think, the kind of things, that the way that Sophos use it is they are using it to augment people as opposed to replace people. How important do you think that is as we start to get to grips with generative AI and its other versions?
That's a really big and very, very good question. So AI, as you rightly point out, is very good in the context of cybersecurity at crunching numbers, recognizing patterns, dealing with the volume. But AI in its current form certainly has a deficiency really when it comes to being able to contextualize things. And it is no substitute for human beings when we get to the point of having to put something into context. So I'll give you a good example. AI is very good at being able to recognize a new bit of malware, but it is not particularly good, if probably doesn't really work very effectively when it comes to the cyber criminals using our own services and systems against us. So common attacks these days that cyber criminals would execute would include things like using RDP, remote desktop services, and stealing identities and then using those to log into the estate. Now, AI probably can't work out the difference between John legitimately logging in because he's supposed to be there versus John's identity being used against the organization. Similarly, things like PowerShell, right? So admins use PowerShell every single day, and AI probably couldn't tell the difference between admin being used or admin using PowerShell to do something legitimate versus the cyber criminals using it in a malicious fashion. So AI is not a silver bullet that solves all challenges, but what it does is it allows the humans to specialize in things like threat hunting and that contextualization point that right now AI can't do that effectively.
Yeah, I think for me, generative AI, and I think you've summed it up quite well there, it causes you to question what is real and what isn't real. You know, if generative AI can not just generate text, it can generate images, it can generate video content as well. And whereas some of that video content isn't great at the moment, as that technology improves, it's going to get better over time. You know, so if we look, you mentioned the actors strike, you know, a generative AI might be quite in almost like an infancy at the moment for generating video content, and it's quite easy to spot.
Jason?
Well, Will Smith eating pizza is a great example.
Not Will Smith eating pizza, no.
For anyone that's not seen it, go and watch it. Don't watch it before bed. It's horrifying. But that's a great example because it's quite obvious it's AI generated now. Mm-hmm. But in 5 years' time, that's going to look exactly as it should, and it's going to be so difficult to spot. It's going to make us question, is this real or is it not real? And when that line blurs, it's very difficult to know what is actually going on. You know, you mentioned there, you know, legitimate tools, PowerShell, remote desktop protocol, logging into a server. Well, how do we know if that is real or not real? How do we ask that question and answer it in such a way? I saw recently in the news, actually, Intel looking to develop a program to recognize AI generated video because of the way that blood flows through someone's face on video, which is quite interesting.
It is, and that's going to become really important actually. So bringing it back to cybersecurity, you know, some of the things that we use today, for example, like facial recognition or voice recognition, if AI is able to replicate your face and your voice effectively, you might find that the cyber criminals are using these multi-factor methods illegitimately to get into an organization. Yeah. So being able to work out and dedupe what is AI and call it out as being fake is going to become a new cybersecurity battleground for sure.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting problem, and you know it's changing quite a lot. You know, there's a lot of interest in AI. There's a lot of investment going into AI. I think that the problem as it looks today will be a different problem next month and certainly next year. You know, it's going to become harder and harder to spot that.
I mean, Jones, as kind of a, you know, because I think we can talk around kind of opportunities that GenAI presents and obviously threats. But obviously, you know, you as a cybersecurity professional, I guess talking about the security implications are both positive and negative are important. But is there any is there any kind of advice that yourself or you or Sophos more broadly, is there any kind of advice initially that you're providing to your customers to say, look, these are the kind of risks that we might see with AI? I know we've talked about, for example, cyber criminals using reconnaissance and then using AI to craft more effective communications. You know, but is there any general guidance, you know, that would be useful for our audience, for example, in what Sophos are providing?
Absolutely, there is. Yeah. So let's talk about some of the ways that generative AI is being used right now, and one of them is employees just using it because they want to get their jobs done quicker. So let's log into ChatGPT or whatever it might be.
Everybody looking at Wayne.
Can you make me a presentation on XYZ? Can you write me a thesis on whatever it might be? I would strongly encourage organizations to check very carefully the terms and conditions associated with all these services, because whose intellectual property is it? And that's a very big legal question, which I'm not going to answer. But take a look at that, because if you've just lost sovereignty of the information you feed into there, or if it could be extracted at some point in the future, that's clearly not good. So I think we can't ignore it. We need to get people to a position where they are using these tools, but being mindful that their data might not necessarily be as protected as it could be. So there's a bit of practical guidance first and foremost. What I would also suggest as well is when it comes to the social engineering and the phishing aspect, I think we touched on it in a previous episode, didn't we? You cannot rely on an email having badly written English and grammatical errors and that sort of thing as a method of spotting that it's a phish, because cyber criminals are absolutely using these services already. And one of the most common uses of it is creating those scam emails, because all of a sudden it looks convincing and they're using the appropriate language and making it compelling and making it look realistic. So you've got to be a little bit more clever now about how you are teaching your staff to go and look for phishing, because those typical tells are just not in there anymore. That's a really significant challenge.
And I think that's a great point as well about, we kind of touched on earlier, didn't we, that there's things that AI is good at, and then there's things that it's not good at, and things like nuance, it's not great at nuance. And that's, I suppose, where teaching people to be aware of this. You can't expect it's going to be our mate, the Nigerian prince, who still owes us money, but our mate, the Nigerian prince, that's probably not, certainly in a business context, that's probably not kind of going to be the email or the vector you see. And of course, it's not just going to be email, is it? We're seeing, because of the speed that this stuff can work at, targeting other channels, Teams, targeting Slack, looking at things like code repositories, but anywhere where people collaborate, is that part of it, to make sure that organizations are aware of the breadth of where they might see some of these problems?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you ought to, and we all do this. I suspect we all operate with an element of cynicism about everything, because we're in cybersecurity, and you kind of look at the world in a slightly different way after a while. But everybody needs to have that little bit of skepticism about every piece of content that you see, because you're right, at some point there is going to be AI generated videos of somebody doing something malicious, supposedly on CCTV, for example. And you've got to think for a second, well, on the face of it, looks legit, but is it real? And we need to have that little bit of a pause to check, to make sure before we carry out actions that might be detrimental to either ourselves or our businesses, that we just take a moment to just double check.
Great. I think that's a great place to end the episode on. We hope that you enjoyed this episode, found it informational. We're available everywhere you get podcasts. We're on YouTube, all homes of podcasts. See you next week.